Welcome. Uh, I want you to picture a scene with me for a second. We are going to travel back in time.
Okay.
It's the early hours of August 7th, 1915, and we are standing on this narrow, really windswept, utterly barren strip of land.
Right, and in the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. And in the trenches all around us, there are hundreds of men just silently waiting in the dark.
Just waiting for the whistle.
Yeah, because in just a few moments, they're going to climb out of those trenches and charge headfirst into what history will record as an absolute textbook military disaster.
It really is one of those moments in history where you find yourself wanting to shout back through time.
Yeah,
Like you're
so.
trying to stop the inevitable from happening. Because you can see all the terrible decisions just lining up perfectly to create a catastrophe.
And that catastrophe is what we are focusing on today. For this deep dive, we're pulling from a remarkably detailed Wikipedia article covering the Battle of the Neck.
Which took place during the Gallipoli Campaign of World War I.
Right. But we aren't just here to, recite the dates and the casualty numbers of a tragic battle. Our mission today is to look at this event as a masterclass in what goes wrong when systems fail.
A massive systemic failure.
We are dissecting a spectacular failure of leadership, of communication, and really the devastating cost of inflexible decision-making. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the geography itself, because you really can't understand the madness of this battle without understanding the ground they were fighting on.
The terrain is everything here. It completely dictated the horrific mechanics of how this tragedy would unfold.
So the area was called the Neck. And looking through the sources, there's a fascinating little linguistic nugget here. The name actually comes from the Africans' word for mountain pass or neck.
Which is strange, right?
Yeah, you might be wondering why Australian and Ottoman Turkish troops in World War I are using a South African Dutch word for their battlefield.
Right.
It's because many of the senior Australian officers had actually previously fought in the Boer War in South Africa about 15 years prior. They brought that vocabulary with them.
Which is actually a brilliant, subtle indicator of the mindset at play here. These commanders were bringing the vocabulary and, more importantly, the tactical mindset of a completely different, older war into a modern mechanized conflict.
They were fighting the last war.
Exactly.
That sets the stage perfectly. But calling it a mountain pass almost sounds too grand. In reality, it was just a perfect, deadly bottleneck. Imagine a strip of land only about 30 to 50 meters wide.
That's barely the width of a football field.
Right. And flanking this tiny strip on both sides are these terrifying sheer drops, 150 meters straight down into deep valleys called Monash Valley and Malone's Gully.
And at the end of this incredibly narrow, totally exposed land bridge, the Ottoman defenders were holding the high ground.
They had the advantage.
Huge advantage. They were entrenched on a knoll known as Baby 700. From there, they had a perfect unobstructed view down the slope. There was no vegetation, nowhere to hide, just bare ground covered in potholes. It was arguably the strongest defensive position in the entire Anzac sector.
Which makes you look at the map and ask, why on earth would any commander launch an attack up a narrow, exposed slope directly into fortified trenches?
To understand that, we need to look at the broader context of the Gallipoli Campaign at that exact moment. By August 1915, the Allied forces had been deadlocked there since the initial landings in April.
3 months.
3 months of brutal, grinding stalemate. The High Command was desperate to break the deadlock and get off the beaches, so they planned a major offensive to capture the high ground of the Sari Bear Range. The attack at the Neck wasn't even meant to be the main event. It was designed as a feint.
A distraction. They were sending men into a meat grinder just to look busy so the enemy would look the other way.
Essentially, yes. The Australian troops were ordered to attack across the Neck to draw Ottoman fire and attention. The theoretical goal was to support New Zealand troops who were supposed to be assaulting a nearby peak from the rear.
Ah, like a pincer movement.
Think of it exactly like a coordinated pincer movement. They were trying to catch the defenders in a vice store. The Australians make a massive, loud distraction at the front door, while the New Zealanders sneak in and break down the back door.
But the backdoor team never showed up on time, and the orders given to the Australians at the front door were they're hard to even comprehend. Keep in mind, these were light horsemen.
Right. Cavalry troops.
Cavalry troops who had left their horses behind in Egypt to fight as infantry. They were eager, but they were not highly trained, dedicated infantrymen. And for this assault, the commanders ordered them to attack the Ottoman trenches using bayonets and grenades only.
Only.
Their rifles were ordered to be completely unloaded.
To modern ears, Sending men into heavy combat without the ability to shoot back sounds like absolute madness. But if we look at the psychology and the rigid military doctrine of the time, the planners had a specific rationale.
Which was?
They believed that if the men had loaded rifles, their natural instinct would be to stop, take cover, and return fire the second they met resistance. And on a narrow 30-meter strip, stopping means the momentum dies.
So by taking away their bullets, the commanders were actively trying to remove human instinct from the equation. They were forcing a behavior, keep running at the enemy trenches no matter what, because you literally have no other option.
That is the ultimate example of top-down theory completely ignoring the bottom-up reality. It looks perfectly logical on a piece of paper in a headquarters tent a mile away.
Right.
They think the men will simply sprint across the gap.
Right.
But it completely discounts the human element, the terrain, and the fact that the enemy has heavily fortified machine guns pointing right at that specific gap.
It's institutional arrogance. And that clash between a rigid, abstract plan and the messy, violent reality of the battlefield is the core system failure we see unraveling here. The planners assumed everything would go exactly as scripted.
But in complex systems, and especially in war, the script is usually the first casualty.
And this script fell apart almost immediately because of a massive timing failure. The attack was scheduled for 4:30 a.m. on August 7th. It was supposed to be preceded by an intense naval and artillery bombardment designed to completely daze the Ottoman defenders right before the Australians jumped out of their trench.
And the bombardment did start.
It did. But then, inexplicably, the field artillery stopped firing at 4:23 a.m., 7 minutes early.
In a coordinated assault, where your survival depends on catching the enemy while their heads are down, 7 minutes is an absolute eternity.
Put yourself in those trenches for a second. You are standing there in the dark. You are holding a rifle that you've been ordered to empty. The bombardment, which is supposed to be your only cover, suddenly goes dead silent. You know the enemy is getting back on their machine guns. What do you do?
And the military doctrine at the time didn't give these local commanders the agency to adapt.
Right.
The local commanders on the ground didn't adjust their plans to account for the early cutoff. They were supposed to attack as soon as the bombardment lifted, but instead they just waited. The sources point to unsynchronized watches between the artillery officers and the assault officers.
Wow.
A simple mechanical oversight, a failure to calibrate before a major operation.
So the attackers sat in their trenches for 7 agonizing minutes, waiting for the designated 4:30 a.m. start time while the enemy recovered. And the Ottoman troops were not amateurs. This area was defended by the Ottoman 19th Division under the command of Mustafa Kemal,
who would later become the founder of modern Turkey.
Exactly. Because the artillery had stopped, they knew exactly what was coming. Those 7 minutes gave them ample time to leave their dugouts, return to their trenches, which were largely undamaged, and man their weapons. They had at least 30 machine guns positioned in depth across multiple tiers of trenches, all trained perfectly on that tiny bottleneck.
What's fascinating here, we have to look at the analysis from author Graham Wilson in 2017. For a century, the accepted historical narrative was that this tragic 7-minute delay allowed the Ottomans to recover and doomed the attack.
Yeah.
But Wilson argues that there actually wasn't a timing delay at all.
I was reading ahead in the notes about this. He looked at the historical accounts and realized that the artillery barrage wasn't early, it was just completely ineffective. Right.
He contends that the Allied artillerymen were terrified of hitting their own troops massing in those forward trenches. Remember how narrow the neck is? And in some places, the opposing trenches were only 20 to 70 meters apart.
That's incredibly close.
Firing artillery into that tight of a window is incredibly risky. So, to avoid friendly fire, they deliberately aimed their guns too far behind the Ottoman front lines. The shells were just sailing harmlessly over the defenders' heads and exploding in the rear.
So even if the watches had been perfectly synchronized, even if the Australians had charged the very second the gun stopped, they still would have been running into fully conscious, fully prepared defenders.
Exactly.
The plan was mechanically doomed before anyone even blew a whistle.
Which brings us to the actual charge. It was organized into 4 waves of 150 men each. At exactly 4:30 a.m., the first wave went over the top. They hopped the bags as the slang went.
And the reality of what happened next is difficult to even process. They were met with an absolute wall of lead. Within 30 seconds, the commander of that first wave and almost all 150 of his men were gunned down.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. The machine gun and rifle fire was so dense that most of them barely made it a few steps out of the trench. A handful of men miraculously reached the Ottoman trenches and threw some grenades, but they were immediately overwhelmed. It was a complete massacre.
And this is where the inflexibility we've been tracking becomes genuinely criminal. The futility of the attack was instantly obvious to anyone with eyes on the battlefield. The men in the second wave were standing right there. They saw exactly what had just happened to their friends.
But 2 minutes later, at 4:32 a.m., the second wave of 150 men followed the first, without question, and they met the exact same fate, cut down before they even got halfway across the neck.
It's a staggering display of bravery by the soldiers, but an equally staggering failure of command by the leadership. The officers in charge of the assault saw 2 entire waves obliterated in under 3 minutes, yet the machinery of the plan just kept grinding forward.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have a direct point of comparison happening at the exact same time, just down the line. Over at a nearby position called Quinn's Post, another regiment was also launching a simultaneous attack.
Right.
They set 50 men over the top, and 49 became casualties almost instantly. But in that case, the local commander on the ground recognized the reality of the situation immediately. He saw the futility, he used his brain, and he made the crucial decision to cancel all further waves. He stopped the slaughter.
That contrast perfectly highlights the complete collapse of communication and leadership at the Nate. Before the third wave was scheduled to go, you had the local commander of the regiment in the trenches, a man named Brazier, actively trying to halt the attack. He knew it was suicide. He went looking for his commanding officer to call it off. But his commander had moved to an observation post and couldn't be found.
So instead of finding the man who could actually authorize a retreat, Brazier runs into the brigade major, a man named Antill. And the sources point out a really toxic dynamic here. Antill was a very strong personality, a Boer War veteran who exerted a lot of influence over the brigade, and he personally disliked Brazier.
He felt Brazier was just being insubordinate by questioning the grand plan.
Yeah.
And this clash of personalities happens at the worst possible moment in the worst possible place. And Hell had just received a fragmented, unverified report claiming that someone had seen red and yellow marker flags flying in the enemy trenches.
The flags?
Right. The standard operating procedure was that if a trench was captured, the attackers would raise these flags to signal success to the rear echelons.
We know now from post-war Turkish accounts that a couple of incredibly brave Australian soldiers from that very first wave actually did manage to survive the sprint, reach the trench, raise a flag, and were immediately killed.
But Antill didn't know that context. He didn't go up to the line to verify the situation. He didn't check to see if the flags were still there or if anyone was actually holding ground. He sat in his bunker, heard the word flags, and decided his plan was working perfectly.
Despite Brazier standing right in front of him, covered in the dust of the battlefield, telling him his men were being massacred, Antill refused to adapt. He ordered the third wave to proceed.
He didn't even try to escalate the matter up the chain of command. It was a decision made in a vacuum, based on phantom flags and sheer personal stubbornness.
Without the ability to reach the general on the beach, Brazier had to go back to his men in the trenches. The quote that survives from that moment is just heartbreaking. He looked at the men of the third wave who had been sitting there listening to the gunfire that killed the first 2 waves, knowing exactly what was waiting for them, and he simply said, "Sorry, lads, but the order is to go."
And so, at 4:45 a.m., the third wave goes over the top, and the result is identical. They are cut to pieces in seconds.
Brazier makes another desperate attempt to reason with Antill. Another officer tries to intervene as well. Antill still blindly orders the men forward. Finally, Brazier manages to locate his actual commanding officer, who eventually realizes the sheer scale of the disaster and calls it off.
But it was too late.
Amidst the chaos and the broken communication lines, parts of the fourth wave had already begun to charge. Some men stayed low, trying to be cautious, but the damage was already done. In a matter of minutes, the charge at the neck was over.
The speed of the destruction is what makes it so chilling. Hundreds of lives ended, not because of a brilliant enemy maneuver, but because a plan dictated they must advance, regardless of the physical evidence screaming at them to stop.
Looking at the numbers here in the sources, it's just staggering. Am I reading this right? Out of the 600 Australian light horsemen who took part in the attack, 372 were killed or wounded.
Yes, well over half the force wiped out in minutes, and the Ottoman losses for repelling this entire assault were roughly 12 dead.
12. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. And because of the tactical situation, the ridge was just covered in bodies. Most of those men lay exactly where they fell for the entire rest of the war. They couldn't be recovered safely.
Just left there.
There's a particularly famous epitaph for a trooper named Harold Rush. He died in that third wave. His body was one of the very few that was actually identified later. His grave marker reads, his last words, "Goodbye, Cobber, God bless you." It's a gut punch. It takes these grand, terrible systems failures and makes the statistics intensely human.
And inevitably, after a tragedy of this scale, the organizational blame game began. The surviving soldiers were furious. They started calling the battlefield Godley's abattoir, placing the blame squarely on Major General Alexander Godley, who was the tactical commander of the entire offensive.
It's the ultimate corporate failing upward scenario, just with infinitely higher, deadlier stakes. You orchestrate a disaster, and what happens to Godley? A few months later, shortly before the Allies withdrew entirely from Gallipoli, he was temporarily promoted to lieutenant general.
Unbelievable.
And after the evacuation, he was made a knight commander of the Order of the Bath. He got a promotion and a knighthood. Meanwhile, the guys who actually realized the plan was broken were treated like insubordinate employees.
It's a bitter pill to swallow when you contrast the knighthood of the commander safe on the beach with the unrecovered bones of the men left on the ridge. Well, the sources note that local commanders like Antill were chiefly responsible for failing to stop the localized slaughter. The higher-level conceptual errors rested with the generals who designed a flawed plan, stripped their men of agency by unloading their rifles, and failed to establish functional communication lines.
So what does this all mean? We promised at the start that we weren't just reciting a grim history lesson. We're looking at why the mechanics of this disaster matter to you listening right now.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Battle of the Neck is a terrifyingly clear, extreme example of the sunk cost fallacy combined with blind obedience to authority. The commanders had invested so much time, prestige, and eventually blood into this specific plan. When the prerequisite conditions failed, when the artillery proved ineffective, when the New Zealanders didn't reach their target to create the backdoor pressure, the logical, rational choice was to abort. But the institutional momentum was simply too strong. They felt they had to do something, even if that something was clearly, demonstrably fatal.
They couldn't deviate from the script. They had their orders. They had literally unloaded their rifles, and they just pushed the button over and over again, sacrificing wave after wave, expecting a different result.
This raises an important question for all of us. Obviously, the stakes in our daily lives are rarely life and death.
Right.
But how often in our own professional or personal lives do we continue a doomed charge simply because the plan was already set?
Too often.
How often do you ignore the reality right in front of you? The project that is clearly failing, the business strategy that isn't working, the investment that's bleeding money, because changing course would mean admitting the initial plan was flawed. Or defying a superior who refuses to look at the ground truth.
It's so much easier to just say, well, those were the orders, or that's how we've always done it in this industry, than it is to stand up and say, stop, this isn't working, look at the data.
The local commander at Quinn's Post did it.
Yes, he did. He looked at reality and saved his men. The commanders at the Neck didn't, and that made all the difference. The tragedy of the Neck is a profound, enduring lesson in the absolute necessity of critical thinking, adaptability, and the courage to challenge a failing system before it destroys everything it touches.
It's a stark reminder that loyalty to a theoretical plan should never supersede loyalty to actual reality.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We mentioned earlier that the Allies ultimately evacuated Gallipoli. That happened in December 1915 as winter set in and the stalemate became unbearable. But right before they completely withdrew, they finally managed to breach the Ottoman defenses at the Neck.
They did.
Do you know how they did it? They didn't order another brave, futile frontal charge with unloaded rifles. They didn't send waves of men into machine gun fire to prove a point. Instead, Allied troops quietly tunneled deep under that narrow ridge, planted a massive mine directly underneath the Ottoman trenches, and detonated it.
Wow.
It killed 70 defenders in an absolute instant, and the Allies simply walked away to their ships. It forces you to wonder, is the most effective way to win an unwinnable battle not to push harder, but to completely rewrite the rules of engagement just as you decide to walk away? Think about it. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.